This egg was sealed away last autumn, with no refrigerator, no power, and no cold at all to protect it. And when it was cracked open months later, the yolk still stood up perfect. For 100 years before refrigeration, an ordinary household could keep a whole winter's worth of eggs fresh without any cold at all. This is the record of how they did it. They had at least 3 different systems for it, and each one looked nothing like the others. But underneath, every single one worked for the same simple reason. Start with the egg itself. The shell looks solid, but it is covered in thousands of tiny pores, which means that slowly and quietly the egg is breathing. As an egg ages, water steadily escapes out through those pores, a little more each week. The air pocket at the wide end grows and the white inside begins to break down. You can watch this happen for yourself. Drop an egg into a glass of water. A fresh one sinks straight down and lies flat, while an old one tips up and floats. Now, nature already guards against all of this. A fresh egg comes out of the hen, wrapped in a thin, almost invisible seal, and that seal has a name, the bloom. But that natural seal is fragile. Wash the egg under a running tap, and you rinse the bloom clean away. And with it, every bit of protection the egg was born wearing. And that is the quiet reason a supermarket egg has to live in the fridge. It was washed and graded before it reached the shelf, so its natural seal is long gone. So the whole puzzle of keeping an egg comes down to one thing: those tiny pores. Seal them shut again, slow that quiet breathing right down, and time itself almost stops for the egg. And that is exactly what every method in the old almanac sets out to do. Each one, in its own way, simply rebuilds the seal that washing and time had stripped away. But before we open the record and read these 3 methods out loud, there is one honest caution that really has to come first. These are historical methods, written down over a century ago. Today's food safety experts no longer recommend waterglassing, so treat what follows as the record of how it was done, not a recipe to copy. Method 1 was the gentlest of the 3, and by far the most common in old farmhouse kitchens, and it started with nothing more than a small tin of ordinary grease. On the very day an egg was laid while its natural bloom was still fresh, the whole shell was rubbed all over with grease, or sometimes with plain petroleum jelly. Each greased egg was then wrapped in a loose twist of thin tissue paper, just enough to keep it clean and to cushion it from knocking against its neighbors. The wrapped eggs were carefully packed into a wooden box, every one standing small end downward, and the whole box was set away somewhere cool, dark, and undisturbed. And small end down was never just habit. It keeps the growing air pocket up at the wide top, so the yolk stays gently cradled in the middle, well away from the shell. And the results were genuinely remarkable for so simple a method. Eggs put carefully away back in September would come out just as fresh for the Christmas baking. That is a solid 3 to 4 months of good eggs sitting in the larder, kept whole and usable with nothing but a film of grease and a sheet of paper. And through all of that, the grease did only one quiet little job. It closed off the open pores, taking the exact place of the natural bloom that handling had worn away. Method 2 was older still, and it cost very nearly nothing at all. Instead of sealing each egg by hand, you simply packed the whole lot of them away in something dry. Wood ash, coarse salt, or dry bran, almost anything fine and dry would do, as long as it could surround each egg completely and close it off from the open air. The eggs were settled down into that dry packing once again, small end pointing downward, and each one was buried deep enough that it never quite touched the next. Then, just once a week, every egg was gently turned over in its dry bed, so that nothing inside the shell ever had the time to settle, drift down, or stick in place. That one weekly turn kept the yolk slowly drifting through the very center of the egg, suspended in the white, well away from the shell wall where it would always spoil first. Kept this plain way, tucked in a cool corner and turned faithfully by hand. The eggs would comfortably hold for some months, carrying a whole household through the depth of winter. A humbler material than grease, and a little more work week to week, but underneath it all, the very same idea. Block the air from the pores, and the egg keeps for the season. And the third method was the strangest of them all, and also the most powerful. This one did not begin in the kitchen, but in a small bottle bought from the chemist's shelf. Inside that bottle was a pale yellow liquid, odorless and slightly syrupy, that looked like nothing more interesting than a thin and slightly cloudy sugar syrup. On the shelf it looked completely unremarkable, sold for just a few pennies, and sitting right there beside the tonics, the liniments, and the tins of furniture polish. But its name was Waterglass, sodium silicate, and once it had been mixed and was waiting there in the crock, it could do something none of the gentler methods ever could. First you mix the thick liquid with water in one careful and particular proportion, just one part of the silicate stirred slowly into 9 full parts of clean water. That thin, milky solution was then poured into a tall earthenware crock, one deep enough to hold and completely cover a whole season's worth of eggs. Then each egg was cleaned and lowered in gently, one carefully after another, building up layer upon patient layer until the whole crock was very nearly full. And every single egg had to sit fully beneath the surface, with about 2 clear inches of solution standing above the very topmost layer to keep all the air sealed out. Down inside the crock, the silicate slowly seeped into every open pore and then set hard, forming a thin shell of actual glass right inside the shell of the egg, sealing it almost perfectly. And a little of it went a remarkably long way. A single gallon of that finished solution could preserve close to 1,000 eggs at once, all resting in the very same crock. And the goal here was no longer just a handful of winter months. With Waterglass, a careful household was aiming to keep its eggs fresh right the way through the entire year. And the real trick of it was timing. You filled the crock in spring, when the hens were laying far more than anyone could eat, and then drew on that store all through the barren winter. And one old self-sufficiency guide put the whole thing into a single plain line. Clean your eggs first, and then simply drop them down into the waiting Waterglass. And that single earthenware crock, tucked away in a corner of the pantry, was enough to keep an entire household in good eggs, right the whole way around the calendar. So where did all of this careful knowledge actually come from in the first place? Well, the trail runs back a good deal further than most people would ever expect. Waterglassing turns up in print as far back as the Boston Cooking School cookbook in the 1880s, and even then it was written up as plain common knowledge. Then, just a decade later, the famous Fanny Farmer cookbook laid the whole method out plainly, step by careful step, for any cook who wanted to put eggs away. And Waterglass even had a pair of older cousins, lime water, and a curious fish gland jelly called isinglass. Different materials again, but every one of them chasing the very same goal. And right through the whole first half of the 20th century, very nearly every careful kitchen knew at least one of these egg-keeping methods completely by heart. In the war years especially, with a few hens scratching about in the back garden and no fridge anywhere in the house, putting eggs down for winter was simply ordinary life. And then, slowly and quietly, the electric refrigerator began to arrive in the ordinary home, and almost overnight, it changed everything about how a family kept its food. And the fridge, very simply, won. It gave far better results for no real effort and nothing toxic at all. And so, one kitchen at a time, the old crock was quietly set aside and forgotten. Which brings us right back to the one question Silas always returns to in the end. The record clearly shows that it once worked, but does it actually still work today? And the honest answer is that it really is not quite so simple, and this is exactly the part you have to weigh carefully before you would ever choose to trust it. Modern food safety extensions like the ones at Penn State and the University of Wyoming no longer recommend waterglassing eggs at home, and they have some very careful reasons. The thin membrane just inside the shell still lets water move slowly through it over time, and along with that water there is a real risk of pathogens slipping inward as well. A modern home rarely stays cold enough for real safety, and careful studies back in the 1940s found that the egg quality simply did not hold up at room temperature. So take all of this exactly as Silas means it, the record of how a thing was once done, honestly kept and faithfully told, and never a recipe to follow blindly in your own kitchen tonight. And the very simplest test of them all is still worth keeping. Drop any doubtful egg into a glass of water. If it sinks, it is fresh, and if it floats, you let it go. And these old systems really have not gone anywhere at all. They are still written down in the almanacs, still proven by 100 years of careful kitchens, just waiting to be read again. Silas quietly closes the book and sets it back on the shelf with all the others, then looks up, already wondering which long-forgotten page the Almanac should give up to us next. And that is one more page from the Almanac. So subscribe and we will keep turning them together, one at a time, because there is a great deal that we have quietly forgotten.